All right, so my name's Adam. I work here at Rebug, and I'm going to talk a little bit about basically summarize the ng-conf. Bill Baker is going to talk a little bit about the Angular CLI and do kind of a live coding demo. And then we have a guest presenter, Shannon Buys, and he's going to talk about optimization and best practices around building production Angular apps and app bundles and lazy loading. So we held an ng-conf extended. Did anyone here attend that this year? A couple of people. So that was the first time that we've done that, and that was almost immediately after we moved into our new space. But we hope to do that again. So for those of you who attended, we'd appreciate any feedback and any input for how we can improve that for the next conference. This presentation, as well as all of the ones that we've given within the past couple meetups, are available here. So let's get started. So if you didn't attend ng-conf, all of the videos are up on YouTube under the ng-conf videos user. You can also find all the slides. And then this link here, Shannon put together kind of a best of ng-conf that summarizes all the talks and slides and things. So it's a nice aggregated view of all the content. So if you wanted to go back and see any of the presentations, those are all available online. So just again, you probably heard this already, but now that Angular has moved to its next version, anything that was 1.x is now Angular.js, and anything greater than or equal to Angular version 2 is just Angular. So we're working, a little bit here to kind of, make our naming and presentations and literature and things like that in line, but going forward, start to use those terms. So ng-conf, I think if we're going to give it a theme, was really about Angular as a platform. So now that version 2 came out of release candidate, we're officially now on version 4. And if you didn't catch the reason for going from 2 to 4, that was due to aligning the version of the Angular router module with all of the other core modules. So now it's just Angular. We're at Angular 4. We'll be looking at Angular 5 soon, and 6, and so on. So, aside from the core modules and the actual bits of the library itself, Angular now is really more about an ecosystem and a platform. So it's not just the libraries, it's things like the CLI, the tooling, the style guide, best practices, ancillary tools like the language service, which provides things like editor support and IntelliSense. So if you're using VS Code or Sublime Text or whatever your editor happens to be, if you are in the business of, say, writing your own editor, you can use the language service to provide that kind of IDE support that we're kind of used to now, both to handle the core functionality and IntelliSense and things like the templates and so forth. There's also a forthcoming specification for building modules and libraries. So if you're a third-party module provider and you're providing, say, a set of Angular components or reusable components, this is something that will be available down the road to help guide best practices for module authors. The material component dev kit, which I'll talk a little bit more later, but this is basically taking some of the core pieces of Angular material design and making those available as reusable low-level utilities. And then finally the standard release schedule, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So version 4 is the current stable version. It's focused mainly on improving the bundle sizes. So Shannon's going to talk a little bit more about the effect of ahead of time compilation. But at version 4, in most cases, there's a fairly substantial reduction in the overall bundle size for a production build. The animations package has now been removed and is a separate module, so you can opt in to bringing in that module if you need animations. If not, it will reduce your final output by tens of kilobytes. The improved ngIf and ng-for template syntax, which I'll show a little bit more. The community built Angular Universal project has been adopted by the Angular team. So it's no longer a third-party community-built project. This has been folded in. It's maintained as a first-party module. So if you're interested in doing server-side rendering, you would be using the new platform server module. And finally, TypeScript has been upgraded to the latest 2.2 compatibility. So I mentioned the improved ngIf and ng-for syntax. There have been some improvements to make subscribing to observables in templates more straightforward. So we can now alias the observable as a variable, and then refer to it in our templates, and then as well as assigning a template variable for the conditional case where we're waiting for the observable to return results. I didn't include an example of what this used to look like, but it's substantially lower barrier to using async pipe in your templates, which generally is a good practice because it handles all of the cleanup and unsubscription when your component goes out of scope. Version 5, which will be coming very soon, is going to be focused on simplicity. So there are things, right now AOT is an opt-in build option. So when you build your production bundle, you can specify that you want the ahead of time compiling or compilation, which generally should be, you should be doing that before you push your code to production. Unfortunately, there are things that can break between the dev build and the production build. So the Angular team is focusing on basically making this the default for the dev build so that you don't run into those issues when you're getting ready to push your code to production. So it'll be a single compilation process for both workflows. And then improving speed and size. So the Angular team has worked very hard, first with switching from System.js to Webpack, which provided a lot of benefits in terms of its tree shaking capabilities and things like that. So those things, the team now is working on really going down at a fine level to see what else can be removed from those bundles. So that will reduce the size and the bandwidth requirements and things like that. CLI is now at a stable 1.0 release, and probably one of the biggest features was ng-eject. So if you were ever wondering how to get to the Webpack config, this is how you can do it. So running this command will actually update your package JSON, update the scripts to call Webpack directly, and will make that config available. It's a fairly heavy-handed approach. If you're building a project on the CLI, generally there's not a good reason to do that, at least not initially. But down the road you might run into cases where you need to use different loaders or things like that. So this immediately sort of solves that problem by making the config available. Longer term, there's been discussions in the past about making the CLI more pluggable. So one option was to build in sort of a plug-in mechanism that would provide hooks to extend the CLI. Going forward, I think they're tending to favor this SDK approach. So instead of simply making the CLI available as a tool, it would actually be composed of a number of reusable components that you could pull into your own build system if need be. What that looks like, I think, is still in flux, but it seems to be sort of the direction that the future versions of the CLI are heading. Other stuff. So TypeScript now is an officially supported language internally at Google. Was not before, although in the keynote they noted there was never really a time when when it had come up to add a new language. So this was sort of the first language that's been added to their official list. I think that's notable probably because in the past we've looked at languages like CoffeeScript and things like that haven't really gotten a lot of adoption. AtScript was the precursor to TypeScript, which was then merged in a partnership with Microsoft. So TypeScript going forward is continues to have good support. I mentioned the release schedule. So beginning with version 4, all future Angular versions will follow semantic versioning. So I think we're probably pretty familiar with that scheme, but basically anything that is a patch version will be bug fixes. I think they said they expect to have those out about every week, so there'd be a new patch version weekly. Minor updates that are backwards compatible, new features, things that might be deprecated in a future version, roughly every several weeks, I think, and then a new major version every 6 months. And those would be major new features, despite that those might contain breaking changes. The Angular team has stated that they're really committed to minimizing the burden to move from one major version to another. So again, this is part of their move towards a platform. In addition to the semantic versions, they'll also be doing the time-based releases. So I'm going to mention that, but yeah, about 3 minor releases every 6 months. And then there's a long-term support plan that begins with version 4. So for enterprise clients or sites that may not be able to move as fast or that need to deal with regulatory constraints and things like that, the LTS support is now being provided for those cases. And then finally, I mentioned the Angular material component dev kit. So there's a tag on GitHub if you go filter all of the issues by the toolkit tag. They list a few that lay out some of the things that need to be done to make this available. It's actually in Angular material. It just hasn't been documented yet. So the intent here is to take all of those kind of low-level utilities that they built for Angular material, so things like that deal with accessibility and responsive design and theming and things like that, and make those available as a separate toolkit. So if you were building your own component set, you would be able to reuse those without necessarily having to subscribe or use the Angular material design library and modules. So that was the 10,000 foot overview. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Let's see, what's search engine optimization? Has it changed?
I would say it's. So are you referring to how Google indexes sites? Yeah, I mean that at this point is standard. I mean, if you're building an Angular site and you're putting it out there, Google is crawling it, and they'll know what to do. Other search engines, Bing and so forth, may or may not be doing that well. So if you need to optimize for those for other search engines, you'd probably be looking at using the new platform server, which is formerly Angular Universal. So in that case, you can actually fully render your template on the server, so that you actually you have a real DOM when it comes down. So if a crawler hits it, they're actually getting the DOM. They don't need to process or run the JavaScript on the page.
Angular Universal is.
It's now a platform server. So it was originally a community built project, third party. The Angular team has taken that and made it a first party module. So essentially, the way that it works is, in any sort of server process. So if you're running Node or Java server, whatever, you can take your Angular app, pass it to a function, and render it out as a string, and then send that back down as the initial payload. And I think Shannon's going to cover that a little bit too, in more depth.
There's also third-party services that you can utilize that will, for robots specifically, that will redirect robots back to a third-party site and have a fully rendered version of that, so that other sites like Bing and whatnot will get a fully SEO compatible feel, and those are rather inexpensive to use. So
yeah, it'll be interesting to see, because that was one of the early solutions. Essentially pre-render your site and be able to serve those pages as static pages. I think the hope is that with things like Universal, that those kinds of services will become less and less necessary. Universal also has a lot of benefits in terms of performance, and if you're building, say, a progressive web app and you want to serve like an app shell for your pages and things like that, it enables rendering those things so that in your initial payload you have something that you can show the user. They get immediate feedback. It feels blazing fast and things like that. And that's really again part of Angular as a platform, being able to provide those capabilities.
So probably reasonable to expect that in the coming months and the new releases and stuff, they'll be kind of making that just kind of second habit to make it UWA and have it kind of maybe render some stuff on the server ahead of time.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's some work going on right now to better integrate the universal pieces, for example, into the CLI. There's the service worker flag, which you can opt into, but it's likely that will become the default. I mean, there's almost no reason not to have a service worker, even if you're just building really for any site, regardless of whether it's a PWA. But those are things I would expect to see pretty soon.